This was in contrast to Second Temple Jews. While there was a variety of Jewish beliefs about the afterlife, ranging from those like Philo, who agreed with Plato that heaven would be in disembodied existence, to the Sadducees, who thought there was no afterlife at all, but that when we died, we simply rotted in the grave, and that was the end of our existence. But the majority of the Jews held to the Pharisaic idea that at the end of time, God would resurrect his saints into an eternal physical existence. Heaven would not be a disembodied existence, but a new heaven and a new earth with new glorified bodies. For the Christians, their belief that Jesus was resurrected was strictly Jewish in origin. It was the Jews who believed that at the end of time, God would resurrect all his children into an eternal bodily existence. However, Wright notes, the Christian belief mutated in several ways, and it is difficult to explain how this happened. First, the Christians made resurrection their central theme. There are many long Jewish works from around that era, which never mention resurrection. But for the Christians, this was their central theme that defined them. The early Christian movement fully centered around the idea that Jesus was resurrected, and their future hope rested in what he had done. As Paul said very early on, if there is no resurrection, your hope is in vain. There is no reason an early Jewish sect would feel the need to do this. Adding to that, the early Jews talked a little about resurrection, but they did not know what it would be like. Would it be shining like a star, as Daniel put it, or would it be a body exactly like the one we have now? But the early Christians moved from this debate to claiming they knew exactly what the resurrected body would be like, based on what they believed had happened to Jesus, and not what they had read from the Old Testament. For them, the resurrected body would be something transformed from the old material into a new incorruptible body with new properties. N.T. Wright notes that Christians like Paul or Matthew would constantly pull from the Old Testament to show Jesus was a fulfillment of the law. The Christians were constantly appealing to the Old Testament to support their case. But strangely enough, when they describe the resurrected body, there is a lack of appeals to the Old Testament description of the resurrected body. If the Christians were ransacking the Old Testament to try to make up a story of a resurrected Messiah, you would expect them to do that with the resurrected body as well, and paint the body of Jesus shining like a star, just like Daniel puts it. But instead, they described a body unlike what people were expecting and provide no Old Testament support for it. The next mutation is the resurrection of the dead has become a two-stage process. They agreed with Pharisaic Judaism that the resurrection would happen to all God's people at the end of time, but they also said it happened to Jesus in advance. There is no reason any Jewish sect would make this claim. The only people to ever suggest a theory like this were in fact the Christians. Jewish saints who had previously died, like the Maccabean martyrs or early prophets, were said to have been vindicated by God and would be resurrected with all God's people at the end of time. But no one ever dared to claim this had already happened to them. If resurrection was just a way to describe how a martyr was vindicated by God, we would expect to see this of all saints who had died, like Moses up through John the Baptist. But we don't see any Jews applying this language. Nor do we see the Christians describing this to have happened to these other saints as well. Only the Christians said this only happened to one man who had died, Jesus of Nazareth. To claim such a thing would not only be incompatible with pagan beliefs, but also with Jewish expectations. To claim to Pharisaic Jews that one person had been resurrected in the middle of time would have been odd as saying that the Roman emperor was the Messiah. No one would have expected such an event to happen, and no one expected this to be about the Messiah. Which brings us to the most important mutation the Christians made. The Christians claimed that Jesus was the Messiah specifically because of his resurrection. No Jews had expected this because no one had expected the Messiah would die, let alone a shameful, humiliating death by the Roman enemy. Yes, there are Old Testament texts that Christians appeal to support their case that the Messiah would die for the sins of mankind, but it is very clear no one had read them in that way until the Christians came onto the scene. The Jews expected the Messiah to be a conqueror who would free God's people from the yoke of Rome and establish an everlasting kingdom of Israel. The Messiah was to be like King David, not a poor man from Nazareth of all places, who was just a spiritual teacher and who the Jewish authorities turned over to the Romans to be shamefully mocked and executed like a criminal, all to die for our sins. The Second Temple Jews didn't believe or expect this to be necessary. Such a portrait of Jesus, for any Jew, should have dispelled any hope that he was the Messiah instantly, as so had happened with other supposed Messiahs from around that time. What I mean to say is, we have evidence for several messianic movements from before and after the time of Jesus, and they all mostly end with the death of the alleged Messiah. And no one at that point thought their death meant they were indeed the Messiah. Quite the opposite. The death proved these men were definitely not the Messiah, and the movements that surrounded them disbanded once they had died. If your Messiah was killed, you either went back to normal life, or you got yourself a new Messiah, as so was the case with every Messianic Jewish movement, except for the Christians. Had the Christians wanted a new Messiah, they had a likely candidate, James, the brother of Jesus. But even according to Josephus, no one ever called James the Messiah, but only the brother of the Lord. All the other Messianic movements from around that time are nothing like what we see in early Christianity.